In the pre-dawn darkness over Jerusalem, air raid sirens shattered the quiet, sending thousands of Israeli civilians rushing into bomb shelters as another barrage of Iranian ballistic missiles descended on the region. It was a scene that has become a recurring nightmare for a nation that has now endured 7 separate missile barrages in a single morning. But even as those sirens wailed and Israeli air defense systems worked to intercept incoming projectiles, something else was happening simultaneously, something far from the civilian streets of Tel Aviv, something in the shadows of a covert intelligence operation that would reshape the operational command structure of Iran's most feared military branch. Overnight, in a strike that senior Israeli officials are now confirming, the commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy was targeted and is believed to have been killed. The man who bore direct responsibility for the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, who commanded the asymmetric naval strategy that has paralyzed 20% of the world's oil supply, who oversaw the deployment of the Ghadir submarine fleet that has kept global shipping insurers out of the Gulf, was located, tracked, and struck inside Iran. Senior intelligence and operations chiefs who were present at a covert naval command center were also targeted in the same operation. Battle damage assessment is ongoing, but senior Israeli officials believe the commander did not survive. This is the story of a conflict that has now entered its 4th week, a conflict where the United States and Israel are demonstrating an intelligence penetration of Iranian Revolutionary Guard, leadership so deep that its most protected figures are no longer safe in their own command facilities. And it is the story of a president who says Iran wants a deal, even as Iranian officials publicly reject every ceasefire proposal placed before them. This is the breaking situation as of this morning. The head of Iran's IRGC Navy has been targeted overnight in a strike attributed to joint United States and Israeli intelligence operations. Senior Israeli officials have confirmed the targeting and indicate a belief that the commander was killed, though battle damage assessment remains ongoing. Simultaneously, Iran launched 7 separate ballistic missile barrages against Israel this morning, sending civilians in Jerusalem and surrounding areas to emergency shelters as air raid sirens activated across the region. President Trump, speaking on Wednesday, stated that Iran wants to make a deal and is negotiating, describing the military campaign as a historic success. United States military officials report that 10,000 Iranian military targets have been struck since Operation Epic Fury began 4 weeks ago. Admiral Brad Cooper confirmed that 2/3 of those sites have been, in his words, destroyed, and that 92% of Iranian naval vessels have been taken out of operational service. Iranian officials have publicly rejected ceasefire proposals. 6 civilians were wounded in a cluster munition strike against a civilian population outside Tel Aviv, and 150 Iranian ballistic missile launchers remain active and operational, with Israeli forces actively hunting those positions. The strike against the IRGC Navy commander represents one of the most significant leadership targeting operations since this conflict began 4 weeks ago. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy is not the same institution as the conventional Iranian Navy. It is a parallel military structure that reports directly to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, rather than through the conventional military chain of command. It is the branch of Iranian military power that has been responsible for asymmetric maritime operations in the Persian Gulf for decades, for the harassment of commercial shipping, for the deployment of naval mines, for the operation of the Ghadir submarine fleet, and for the strategy of Strait of Hormuz closure that has produced the global energy disruption driving oil prices upward by more than 50% since this conflict began. The commander of that force was not a peripheral figure. He was the architect and operational director of the maritime strategy that has proven most strategically consequential in this conflict. His presence at a covert naval command center, alongside senior intelligence and operations leadership, suggests that the IRGC Navy was operating under heightened operational security, an attempt to protect its command structure from precisely the kind of precision strike that ultimately found them. The fact that joint American and Israeli intelligence was able to locate that covert facility, to identify the specific individuals present, and to execute the strike represents an intelligence penetration of IRGC operational security at a depth that the Iranian command structure will now be forced to reckon with across every dimension of its operations. Former Royal Navy and intelligence officials have observed that the ability to locate senior commanders inside covert facilities within Iran demonstrates a level of human intelligence infiltration that extends well beyond what electronic surveillance alone can provide. Someone with knowledge of the commander's movements and the facility's location was providing information to American and Israeli intelligence. That operational reality will create profound uncertainty within the IRGC leadership about who among their own trusted personnel has been compromised. To understand the full significance of this morning's developments, it is necessary to understand the history of the IRGC Navy and how it came to occupy the position it now holds as the primary instrument of Iran's strategic response to American military superiority. The Revolutionary Guard was established in the immediate aftermath of the 1979 Iranian Revolution as a parallel military force designed to protect the revolutionary government from threats both external and internal. Unlike the conventional Iranian military, which the new government inherited from the Shah and regarded with some suspicion, the Revolutionary Guard was ideologically committed to the revolution's principles and reported directly to the supreme leader. The naval branch of the Revolutionary Guard was expanded and professionalized in the years following the Iran-Iraq War, drawing the operational lesson from that conflict that conventional naval engagement against technologically superior adversaries produced unfavorable outcomes. The tanker war phase of the Iran-Iraq conflict, during which both sides attacked commercial shipping in the Gulf, demonstrated that economic disruption of the waterway produced strategic leverage disproportionate to the military forces required to create it. That lesson became doctrine. The IRGC Navy developed the fast boat swarm tactics, the mine warfare capabilities, the asymmetric submarine program, and the coastal missile batteries that collectively constitute Iran's strategy for making Strait of Hormuz transit economically and operationally untenable for adversary forces. For decades, that force operated with relative impunity, harassing shipping, seizing vessels, conducting operations that American and Allied naval commanders found provocative but fell short of the threshold that would justify a comprehensive military response. Admiral Brad Cooper's statement this morning that those days are over, that 92% of Iranian naval vessels have been destroyed, and that Iran has lost the ability to meaningfully project naval power around the region and the world, represents the most direct American military assessment of what Operation Epic Fury has accomplished against the conventional elements of that force. The survival and continued operational status of the Ghadar submarine fleet, the element specifically designed for Strait of Hormuz operations, remains the unresolved dimension of the maritime picture. The major figures whose actions and statements are shaping this conflict come from backgrounds that reflect the fundamental asymmetry of the engagement. President Donald Trump, the 47th President of the United States, has framed Operation Epic Fury from its inception as a demonstration of American military capability without precedent. His statement Wednesday that the United States is winning so big that nobody has ever seen anything like what is being done with Iran reflects a communication strategy designed to reinforce the narrative of overwhelming success while simultaneously creating the conditions for the diplomatic off-ramp that his associates say he is actively seeking. Trump has been clear through multiple statements that he wants to bring this operation to a conclusion in the coming weeks, and his communications suggesting that Iran wants to deal, while Iranian officials publicly reject that characterization, reflect what analysts describe as a negotiating dynamic conducted through public signaling rather than formal channels. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt's statement that President Trump is prepared to unleash hell if Iran does not reach a peace agreement, and that any further violence will be the result of the Iranian regime's refusal to understand that it has been defeated, represents the pressure dimension of that dual-track approach. Admiral Brad Cooper, whose public statements have provided the most specific military accounting of Operation Epic Fury's results, has described the degradation of Iranian naval capability in comprehensive terms, while the Ghadir submarine situation remains conspicuously absent from official tallies. Steve Yates, a national security analyst and former deputy national security advisor, offered the assessment this morning that the joint American-Israeli intelligence and operational performance in this conflict is something that will be studied for years, and that the division of labor between the two allies represents a model of alliance military coordination at the highest level. The multidimensional impact of this conflict's fourth-week developments extends across every domain of strategic analysis. Politically, the contradiction between Trump's assertion that Iran wants a deal and Iranian officials' public rejection of ceasefire proposals reflects a negotiating dynamic that political analysts note is not necessarily contradictory. Public rejection of negotiations while private channels remain active is a standard feature of conflicts where each side must manage domestic political audiences with different tolerances for concession. Trump's reference to Iranian officials being afraid to acknowledge their desire for a deal because they fear their own people, and being afraid they will be killed by the United States, frames the situation as one in which the Iranian leadership is caught between irreconcilable pressures. The Trump administration's request for $200 billion reported last week signals a financial commitment to this operation that implies a timeline extending well beyond the immediate coming weeks, regardless of public statements about swift resolution. Economically, the oil price impact of this conflict has reached levels that are translating directly into household budgets in countries with no connection to either party. The 17 incidents against commercial shipping documented in the first 16 days of March, combined with the Lloyd's of London withdrawal of war risk coverage, have produced a disruption to global energy supply chains whose compounding effects are visible in gasoline prices, heating costs, and the broader inflationary pressure that energy price increases introduce throughout supply chain economics. Legally and constitutionally, the conduct of Operation Epic Fury has proceeded without a formal congressional declaration of war, operating instead under the executive authority framework that American military operations have increasingly relied upon since the authorization for use of military force resolutions of the post-September 11th era. The scale of the operation, 10,000 targets struck over 4 weeks, places it among the most extensive American military campaigns since the 2003 Iraq invasion, and the legal framework governing its continuation will face increasing scrutiny as the conflict extends. Internationally, the refusal of European NATO allies to commit forces to mine-clearing operations in the Strait, described by the German defense minister as a suicide mission, has created a visible fracture in the alliance consensus that the Trump administration has responded to with sharp criticism, while simultaneously pursuing the bilateral coordination with Israel that Steve Yates described as a model for allied military operations. Expert opinion on this morning's developments reflects the genuine complexity of a situation that does not resolve into simple narratives of victory or defeat for either side. Political analysts note that the targeting of the IRGC Navy commander, if confirmed, removes from the operational picture the individual most directly responsible for the maritime strategy that has proven most consequential for global economic stability, but they also note that institutional knowledge does not disappear with any single commander, and that the Ghadir submarine fleet's operational doctrine, developed over decades and embedded in the training and procedures of its crews, will continue to function under new leadership. The mine warfare situation in the Strait, which requires a clearing operation that no current coalition partner has committed to conducting, remains unchanged by this morning's strike. Analysts who track the insurance markets as a leading indicator of operational conditions observe that Lloyd's of London has not signaled any movement toward restoring Gulf transit coverage, which they describe as the most sensitive and accurate measure of whether the ground truth in the Strait has changed. Public sentiment in the United States, based on polling conducted in the third week of the conflict, reflects strong support for the military operation among Republican voters and more divided opinion among independent voters who are weighing the stated military successes against the economic costs of elevated fuel prices. International observers, particularly in energy-importing economies in Asia and Europe, have noted the distinction between the military narrative of overwhelming success and the commercial shipping reality of a partially closed waterway, describing the gap between those two pictures as the central unresolved tension of this conflict's fourth week. The broader context of this morning's developments connects to a pattern of escalation and targeted leadership strikes that has characterized Operation Epic Fury from its earliest phases. The operation began 4 weeks ago with strikes designed to degrade Iran's air defense systems, its ballistic missile storage facilities, and its conventional naval capabilities. The success of those initial strikes, which eliminated Iran's most capable surface combatants and its largest submarine platforms, established the operational tempo that has continued with the targeting of senior IRGC leadership. The progression from infrastructure and equipment to command personnel reflects a deliberate escalation ladder intended to increase the cost of continued Iranian military activity and to degrade the institutional capacity of the IRGC as an organization capable of sustaining complex operations. The ongoing Iranian ballistic missile barrages against Israel, 7 this morning alone, with 150 launchers still operational, and Israeli forces actively hunting those positions, represent the dimension of Iranian military capability that has proven most difficult to fully suppress. The cluster munition strike against a civilian population outside Tel Aviv, wounding 6 people, demonstrates that Iranian forces retain both the will and the capability to conduct attacks on Israeli civilian areas, despite 4 weeks of sustained American and Israeli military pressure. This fits into a larger trend in which each side has demonstrated both the ability to inflict pain on the other and the inability to fully suppress the adversary's retaliatory capacity within the time frame that political leaders on both sides are managing. The developments that analysts and observers should watch in the coming days are specific and sequenced. The battle damage assessment of the overnight strike against the IRGC Navy commander will be the first and most immediate question. Confirmation of his death would represent a leadership loss for the IRGC Navy, comparable in organizational impact to the elimination of Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, which disrupted IRGC operational planning across the region for months. Iranian ballistic missile launch activity in the hours following that confirmation will be the most direct indicator of whether the Iranian leadership interprets the strike as a signal to escalate or accelerate the private negotiations that Trump has suggested are already underway. The mine-clearing operation question remains the pivotal unresolved issue for global shipping and energy markets. Watch for any signal from European governments, particularly Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, of movement toward reconsideration of their refusal to commit mine countermeasure vessels to Gulf operations. Any such signal would represent the most consequential development for commercial shipping resumption since this conflict began. The partial Iranian oil export question, connected to the sanctions relief that the Trump administration has quietly provided, will be visible in crude oil flow data from Iranian ports. If those flows continue or increase, it will confirm the shared operational interest in partial straight functionality that connects the two adversaries' economic incentives beneath the surface of active military conflict. The $200 billion funding request will face congressional review that will produce the most explicit legislative debate about the legal and strategic framework of Operation Epic Fury since it began. What this morning's developments represent, taken together, is a conflict that has reached a phase of maximum strategic tension between overwhelming military force and asymmetric geographic and operational resilience. The United States and Israel have demonstrated an intelligence penetration of IRGC command structures deep enough to locate and strike the naval commander responsible for the Strait of Hormuz strategy inside his own covert command facility. 10,000 targets have been struck, 92% of Iranian naval surface vessels have been destroyed. Iran's air defense systems have been severely degraded. Its senior military leadership has suffered losses that the organization will take years to replace. And yet this morning, air raid sirens sounded over Jerusalem. 7 ballistic missile barrages descended on Israel. A cluster munition struck civilian areas outside Tel Aviv. The Strait of Hormuz remains functionally closed to Western commercial shipping. Global oil prices remain more than 50% above their pre-conflict level. The Ghadir submarines have not been found. The mines have not been cleared. The insurance coverage has not been restored. Steve Yates offered the assessment this morning that what the United States is doing militarily could not have been better executed, and that the joint division of labor with Israel will be studied for years. Caroline Levitt stated that any violence beyond this point will be because of the Iranian regime's refusal to understand that it has been defeated. President Trump said on Wednesday that the United States is winning so big that nobody has ever seen anything like it. All 3 of those statements may be simultaneously accurate and insufficient. The question that will determine this conflict's actual resolution is not whether the United States has won militarily. It is whether winning militarily is sufficient to reopen the waterway that 20% of the world's oil supply depends on. That answer is still being written. This is from Report, Evidence First, Analysis Second. What it means for you always.